as I was reading your work and then hearing you talk, you say it's a kind of a radical idea to think about these sort of structural issues as informing, deaths by suicide, but also the sort of inverse of that, I guess, would be like, from an environmental studies standpoint or an environmental justice standpoint, is it also radical to say that deaths by suicide because of environmental factors is something that is not really well considered? I mean, you pointed out in some of your kind of assessments of environmental impact statements or assessments by governments, but also by corporations or industries who are going into these areas. I just want to know, like, how do you deal with these sort of critiques of like how, I'm just thinking of like this industry person was like, well, this person obviously had mental health issues. So it's not my fault that, we contaminated the water. It's this person's individual choice that they made. I mean, this is like, maybe I'm answering the question for you right now because
it's bullshit. Like, it's such bullshit. I mean, am I allowed to say that? Sorry, I didn't realize.
You can say it. Go ahead.
Okay, it's total bullshit. Here's a good example. De Beers Mining Corporation extracting gold and other minerals and metals from Turtle Island and Australia and Central America. This giant multinational corporation. Their CEO runs a northern race to raise awareness about suicide in First Nations, runs across a highway built to transport precious metals, runs that road to bring awareness to suicide in First Nations. A mining corporation in Manitoba that recently spilled toxic chemicals onto the water source called me, asking me where they should donate a few $1 million to the community to promote mental health and wellness. I don't think these mining corporations and extractive commercial industries are clueless. I think they understand very clearly that there are not only social impacts of extraction in communities that might produce some of the social conditions and dimensions of suicidality. So you can think about like the changes that industrialization brings to society, the shifts that temporary workers entering in and out of a community, the role of like gender-based violence that happens in mines and these sorts of things. Those all have ripple effects on health outcomes, right? But what I think is not unclear to these companies either is that when you poison the water, when you produce unlivable conditions that fundamentally alter a people's relationship, not only to one another, but to a place, and a place that has, we're from similar territory. So I know these places for us have spiritual significance. They're part of how our creation stories are told, that these relationships are sacred to us, and that when those material environments and all of the ways that they are so much more are become sites of industrial violence, I do not believe for a moment it is unclear to these companies that those are health impacts that can be traced to environmental change. The kind of moment for me, watershed moment for me, was in 2016. There was a cluster, a contagion of suicides that took place in and around Attawapiskat First Nation in Ontario. And Attawapiskat's connected to the Attawapiskat River system, and it's within the downstream of mining and fairly significant industrial mining. And
they call this area like the Ring of Fire, right?
The Ring of Fire, yes. Although in the Anishinaabe language, it's the place where the rivers meet. Which is quite a contrast of I would say like epistemologies and ontologies about land and water.
I didn't quite understand, like, when I was looking at some of this stuff. Is Ring of Fire a derogatory thing, or is it a thing of like I couldn't I was like, is this something that's like a vernacular of people who are criticizing industry, or is this what industry actually calls itself like in that region? Like I
This
couldn't
is
quite.
what this is part of it. Part of it is just description of the deposit and how it's shaped. But yeah, I mean, there's a. I won't speak for those communities in the sense of like what it should be called, but I do know that there are differences of opinion about it. And one thing that really stood out to me with Attawapiskat is when this happened in the community, the government of Canada and even Trudeau, authorized these sort of emergency spending to send up a group of social workers to respond. They asked young people in that community, what would it take for Nishnawbe or for Attawapiskat young people in Attawapiskat to feel well? Young people in that community said something really interesting. They said, the things you might expect, like, opportunities to connect with elders, cultural language opportunities, sports, access to health services was one. Those were things I all expected to see. But what I did not expect to see, which kind of blew my mind, was dust control. Dust control. And then at the very end, a meeting with the Prime Minister of Canada. That would help make young people well in this community. Dust control shocked me for a number of reasons, but as I began to dig into it, I learned that the living conditions, were ones where there was constantly diminished air quality because of the conditions of the mining in the region. And it's true in many parts of Canada where there are intensifying extractive industrial interests in Indigenous land. Not only is the water quality threatened, but the very air that we're breathing is deeply impacted by an increasing toxicity or pollution that you can point to directly the impacts of increased industrialization of extraction. And what I think is fascinating about this example is like those young people were just asked an open-ended question about like what would help make life better for young people in this community, what would help you feel well. And they pointed very directly to, yes, the kind of things we might say is like maybe the conventional approaches to like promoting well-being and health and wellness, but they also pointed to very material things that tell us something about the conditions of environmental justice, injustice that First Nations, among other Indigenous communities, are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So to go back to your question, I think that there will only continue to be an increasing recognition of the role of environmental violence as a context or an ecological dimension of health issues like suicide. But I would maybe want to go even more further, like as an Indigenous studies intervention, to say that I think suicide can tell us something about the conditions of land, that we don't just have to think about the environmental justice as a way of understanding what's happening when we see increases of death, but we know that that's the assumptions and the assertions of Indigenous studies is that these are not unidirectional, that the condition of our people often is a reflection of the condition of spaces and the places where we live our lives, and land is suffering. If the land is suffering, the people will suffer. And vice versa. When the people are well, the land has to also be well. And if it isn't, then there's actually a question about how well are we. So that kind of, I think there's an opportunity for us to think about these like interrelationships of environmental justice and health justice in ways that are, bidirectional.